Yeah. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon. Uh, Paulo, I'm very honored to welcome you guys here. First of all, thanks much for accepting joining us in this panel. Um, I guess we'll have some fun here amongst the pains of the pandemic and homeschooling and homeworking and the like. So thank you so much, and thanks also the audience. I guess it's interesting because in live like that, we can see the audience, so we can pretend whatever we want. So I guess we have an enormous audience, but for the shy ones, we can just pretend that we have just a tiny audience and a chat, a small chat. So welcome and thank you so much. So briefly, very briefly, I'll just present our panelists today. To my left side, to my far left, I have Jenn. She's a counsel at Freshfields. She's based in DC, but she also works at Brussels, so she can bring some European flavor, so to say. Also, we have Antonia Sherman. She's a partner at Linklaters. She is based in New York, and she could focus maybe on a U.S. perspective, but of course we will have a lively chat here, so everybody will be able to talk to any issue they want to. Below me, so to say, to the left, we have the honor to have Paulo Burnier. Paulo is a very well known in Brazil and elsewhere, of course. He used to be our ambassador, foreign minister at CADI. Now he's at OECD as a senior competition expert. Paulo, thanks, especially because I know you are sparing some time that would be dedicated to just born twins. So it's just congrats about that and welcome too. And last but not at all least, just below me, I think we have the Commissioner Luis Braido, my colleague economist. We are in a stage, despite our being an economic consultancy, the stage is taken, as always, by lawyers. But I have some safeguard with Luis, hopefully. So these are our distinguished panelists. Thank you so much for being with us. And let's get started. I'll just say very briefly, very briefly, I promise, some background before we go with our panelists. I would like to highlight two topics we have been discussing around the world before the crisis. One, let's say non-price effects, mostly innovation. In the wake of Maya Monsanto, maybe some other high-profile cases in many jurisdictions, but mostly Europe, have presented concerns related to the negative impact of mergers in industries that have innovation as a major competitive weapon. It was kind of a novelty, mainly because the merged entity was asked to divest its research unity. Lots of complaints on one side, stating that that kind of intervention was not based on sound economics, um, kind of speculative theorizing. The products just did not even exist as such. Uh, Many economists would agree, entrenched in the identity between sound theory and prices, like Chicago style, the comfortable zone, so to say. But some others kind of welcomed the experience, eager to enlarge our approach towards innovation and like quality and non-price in general. So one. Second, too much concentration, mostly in the US, would deprive competition to the benefit of big business, big tech. We have right now, I guess, some today, high-profile hearing in the US of some big techs at the House. This is on the agenda right now. And this would bring the side effect of downward pressures on wages. And sometimes people say that this would kind of pave the way for populism. Also a kind of a political approach as well, bringing back politics to economics, and this is all over the place. And so the claim is, let's be stricter, mirroring somehow Europe, so they say. A broader economic approach, including innovation as a competition engine, and also a broader approach at market power, so to say, not just the usual tools. The antitrust regime needs a refresh, so they say, the discussion says. Then the crisis. The crisis hit the world, claiming victims also among businesses. Small, medium, big business. Many would say this is the chance to be even stricter. In the US, stricter, so to say, avoid killing acquisitions, but I would say rescue acquisitions of some opportunistic mergers. They should be blocked. But on the other side, many would ask for just the opposite. Let's relax, be more welcome to failing firm plead. So this is, I guess, is somewhat the background. I guess we are better now, Jenn. Just for the background noise, sorry. So the question is, the question was, and now again, is it right for reform? Do we need a reform? We have some many transitionary measures, but then back to the old normal. What to expect? And what to expect? This is kind of a U.S. Europe dialogue somehow, but also Brazil. How are we? Where are we in this? Are we in between our own place? What to say about that? We are facing challenges as well. This is just a bit of a background. I guess we'll have some lively discussion here. I think first we would be willing to have Paulo from the OECD more global perspective, he would be most welcome to present some comments and some views from this point of view, and kind of set the stage for us. So please, Paulo, would you be willing to talk a bit?
Yes, thank you so much, Bernardo. Can you hear me well? Yes?
Yes, yes. Already on mute. Okay, yeah.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Congratulations for the initiative of putting forward this this kind of discussion, which we'll welcome very much. So thanks a lot on behalf of myself and the OECD for the invitation, for us for taking part of this discussions. Hello to my dear panelists, in particular to Commissioner Luis Braido, who I appreciate and learn a lot from his academic background, and also now as an enforcer. So Bernardo, I'll try to be very brief in order to share a little bit what how the OECD has been tackling the COVID-19 issues, in particular in the field of merger control. And hopefully this might sort of set up a scene, at least or help to set up a scene for our discussion. So I'll try to be very brief. What the OECD did, and as you know, the crisis hit first Asia, then Europe, then the Americas, Latin America and the US. So there was 1 or 2 months between each of these moments. So in the OECD, in the month of March, a few months ago, the OECD decided to set a task force, a COVID-19 task force, in different fronts, including in the competition front. So within the competition division, I was part of this team that was responsible for screening the main competition issues related to COVID-19. And then what we did is that we drafted some notes. They are public, they are available on the website, hoping to provide some guidance for both competition authorities and governments in related to many issues in the field of competition policy during times of crisis. First, there was a distinction made between current issues, heartbreaking issues that competition authorities and government should look at today, now, during the crisis, and also a little bit more forward-looking in order to provide some guidance on the aftermath, on the future perspectives, because there's some decisions that competition authorities, and I would say in particular governments, may take today that will have an impact in the following years. So one should keep an eye in the consequences of these decisions in the long term too. So this is a little bit of the background. Now I'll concentrate a little bit in merger control. What we did in merger control, the OECD released a paper, again, it's available, trying to collect different comparative experiences from around the world related to crisis situations. So this is not COVID-19, of course, it's a huge crisis, but this is not the first crisis that the world is facing. So there is lessons learned from past crises that might be useful to shed light into current problems, current challenges. So this is one of the purpose of the paper, trying to pick up on past crisis experiences and shed light in particular issues that might be important for now in the COVID-19 crisis. In order to try to be simple and brief, I would like to explore 2 main dimensions of this paper that the OECD published in March, April, in the field of merger control, in particular in COVID-19 crisis, and one is related to competition enforcement. The second dimension is related to advocacy. So in terms of competition enforcement, I would say that the main message that the OECD would like to highlight in terms of comparative look and policy-driven issues is competition authorities, please do not relax competition rules during the period of crisis. I think this is the main message in terms of enforcement. Do not relax competition rules during the COVID-19 crisis. So Bernardo has put it in a very elegant way, provocative and elegant way. Should competition authorities be more strict or less strict? So in line of this main message of the OECD, I would say that neither one. I mean, competition authorities should be fair. Competition authorities, like referees, they should be fair. They should concentrate in protection of competition, protection of consumers in the long run. Of course, concrete cases, they're not as simple as it seems. So it's easy to say, difficult to apply in many situations. But at least as a principle, apply competition rules as they stand. Having said this, I'm still in the first dimension related to enforcement. Having said this, of course, case analysis may have impact, or the crisis may have impact in case analysis, because there are behavioral issues that might change. There are market issues, remedies. So there are the crisis does have consequences in the analysis of the case. So just to be clear, trying to be clear, one, the competition authority should, of course, try to include elements of the crisis in the assessment of cases, but that's different from changing the rules or applying different rules. So we're applying the same rules, but considering that economics and the economy, it's a moving beast, and the crisis does bring specific challenges. I would say specific to certain sectors, to certain markets, that should be considered by competition authority when running a competition assessment, for instance, within a merger review. So I'll say this is the main message in terms of enforcement. I'll say a quick word on advocacy in order to leave room for colleagues and for our discussions, Bernardo. Second dimension that I would like to highlight concerns advocacy in the sense of the role of competition authorities vis-a-vis the promotion of competition principles. And I think this role is reinforced during the crisis. We have seen around the world many governments taking decisions that in a way go against competition. It's legitimate in a way because governments have various public interests to balance. So there is employment issues, there is industrial policy issues, there is competition policy. So there's many policies that a government needs to find a compromise or a balance, and this is legitimate. I mean, it's part of democracy and it's part of the role of governments. But I would say that from the competition authority standpoint, competition authorities could and should, if I may say, play an even more active role in competition enforcement in order to inform governments about decisions and maybe flagging some alternative options that might be less restricted to competition, alternative options that may be pro-competitive. So competition authorities, I think they do have a very important role to play in advocacy, promoting competition, informing government about decision, and highlighting the advantages and disadvantages of certain governmental decisions. To be more precise, maybe to provide a specific example, and then I'll finish on Bernardo and leave the floor for you and opportunity for others for us to discuss. We have seen many countries, or at least a few countries, in which governments have applied, I would say, bailout policy. So we can see, for instance, the airline sector. Some countries, including from developed economies, have decided to buy a share, if not the control, at least a bigger part, a bigger take on airline company, with a very legitimate purpose of maintaining maybe what we can call it essential service, an essential transportation service. But what competition authorities might, to provide an example, may do is maybe to highlight the importance of thinking about what we can call an exit plan. So an exit strategy. So, okay, governments are putting in, are buying, if not the control, a stake, shares in companies. So their private companies are becoming more public in terms of size. This, in a way, goes against the wind that has been blowing for the last 10, 20, 30 years around the world, which is liberalization. So in order to deal with this small paradox or this conflict, one should maybe try to think about exit plans. So, okay, well, governments are putting in money, are putting in efforts, investing in private companies in order for a legitimate purpose. But one should maybe think, okay, should governments be thinking about selling it back to private sector in 2-3 years from now? When? How? With which colors? This is something that competition authorities might play a role, just to provide a more specific, concrete example on the more broad set scene that I hope to have described. So Bernardo, I don't want to take too much of our time. I'll pass you back the floor, and of course I'm available to question, comments, and for our discussions. Thank you so much.
Thanks much, Paulo. Great comments. Paulo, as we would expect from the standpoint of OECD, and we have, of course, learned about the OECD recommendations earlier. So it's of course not to make it shallow. It's composed by many countries observations, and it's a more general rule. So stick to the old rules. Let's stick to the old rules and just try to apply them in accordance with the present situation, and let's hope that the future would be pretty much like as the past, and so the economists would have the guidance on forecast, but we are usually mistaken for wrong forecasters. But anyway, this is our professional bias, isn't it, Luis? And then let's hope that the economists will provide right forecasts. But even and I'll turn to Jenn to bring us some perspective on Europe. But even before the crisis, the discussion was live as related to Europe being too strict, so to say, as compared to the US and elsewhere and other jurisdictions. I'll bring just a Brazilian example. I'd not expect you to comment on this, of course, but not even Luis. But we have had recently the Boeing acquisition of Embraer, Brazilian Embraer. It's gone now, but it has been before being dead. CADE has cleared the operation without restrictions whatsoever, and but it was stuck in Europe as well in the Commission, and then I guess that just for the records or no records, I don't know what they would say, but just a longer review at minimum. So more strictness. Some would link this bias, so to say. It's not a bias, of course, to Europe lagging behind in competitiveness, in productivity. maybe, and then a hint for our discussion. Uh, now we have maybe some a new scene, despite the crisis being just for 1 year or so. But maybe would be an opportunity to refresh. What are your thoughts on this, Jenn? Please. Thank you so much for being with us.
Sure, and thank you very much for having me. So you're right that the EU has had a reputation, especially in recent years, for being a stricter enforcer, certainly than the US DOJ and FTC, but potentially also than some other regulators around the world. And I think it is fair to say that in certain cases, the EC has pursued what one would kindly call novel theories or adventurous theories, and has sort of pushed the bounds in certain cases, including, for example, Dow DuPont and their innovation theory of harm. I think, on the other hand, it would be a bit bold to tie that to a lag in EU productivity or competitiveness due to antitrust, because if you take a step back and think about merger control as a whole, it's still true that in the US, in Europe, that 95% plus of cases are cleared in phase one with very little investigation, and raise no issues. Then you have this small subset of cases that either get an in-depth look or require remedies. And then of those cases, there's an even smaller percentage where you have, Europe pushing things a bit farther than other regulators may do. So, I think it would be quite a lot to say that that very small handful of mergers somehow is overall impacting the productivity of Europe. That would be, I think, quite a stretch. But, on the other hand, we certainly do see, especially politicians and regulators all over Europe, talking a lot about whether EU merger control is too strict, and in particular, whether it's been too strict in some specific cases that have involved deals that were meant to thwart off growing competition, especially from China. And so you've seen the economic ministers of France and Italy making a lot of noise about whether EU competition law has gone too far and is stopping Europe from being competitive in very specific sectors. Now, those complaints are not kind of an overarching complaint about EU merger control. They are linked to very specific cases where those governments had a very vested interest in the transaction. So, again, I think it's difficult to say that the merger control and the EU economy are so closely tied together, but certainly it's the case that there have been instances in recent years where the EU has pushed things perhaps too far or very far, and could back up a bit. And there have been a lot of criticism of some of those recent decisions in that regard.
Thanks, Jenn. Now, maybe Antonia would be willing to share some thoughts with us. Some are saying that the U.S. and now they are kind of vocal, I would say. We have election time, so this is all over the place, stress times. But anyway, many would claim that U.S. should kind of mirror Europe, but many would also claim to even more relaxed approach from the U.S. So, of course, we can always say this would be a case-by-case analysis. So, but I guess we can have more than that from Antonia. Please.
Sure. And thanks, Bernardo, for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Thanks much.
I totally agree with Jenn that really, if you think about it, the cases where the U.S. analysis and the outcome in the U.S. and Europe diverges is really very small. So I actually think they're more aligned than one would think, and certainly they're in the regulators are in very close touch with one another. In the US, I think the conversation actually, I would say, particularly given that we do have this election coming up that everybody in the world, I think, is very aware of, I think the conversation seems to be more actually, should we be more interventionist? Should we step away from the consumer welfare standard? Should we take into account things like the effect on employment of a merger? There's a lot of politicians and activists who are on the left in the Democratic Party who are talking about how industries have become so much more concentrated over the last 25 years. And is that because of the failure on the part of the regulators to really enforce the Clayton Act and enforce merger control? So I think, and interestingly, if we see a Biden administration, particularly if the Democrats also take the House and Senate, I think we'll see these discussions really come to the fore as part of kind of an agenda of trying to sort of ameliorate inequality. And the question there is, should antitrust policy be used as a tool to ameliorate inequality, or should the enforcers really just stick with looking at the economics and looking at pricing and competition rather than looking at, for example, the sort of holistic effect of concentration, where one example is where you've got this sort of charming main street with little boutiques and shops, and then a large superstore opens up on the outskirts of town, and everybody goes to that superstore because the prices are so much lower. But you end up losing that main street and that charm. And how do you quantify that? And is that something that antitrust should take into account, or is that more sort of industrial social policy? I also think that the focus on innovation is absolutely here to stay, regardless of whether the administration changes or not. And that is actually something that I think is the U.S. I think was already focusing on innovation, but certainly with the discussion in Europe and the willingness of the European Commission to look at sort of maybe more I don't know what the adjective is, more innovative theories regarding harm to innovation. Certainly, that is something that comes up in pretty much every transaction that we work on. There's always a discussion about the effect of innovation. We do talk to clients about possible competition in the field of R&D efforts, and of course in the pharma industry, innovation has looking at the pipelines has long been the case. But certainly I think that is really spreading to every industry. And I think merging parties, regardless of their industry, would do well to think about whether there's some kind of innovation angle. Because I would argue that in almost every industry, you will find some kind of innovation, and you will find some kind of competition based on the ability to bring innovative products to the market.
Yeah. And Antonia, maybe if I can just add one point to that. I mean, I agree with everything you just said. And on the innovation point in particular, one thing that's interesting is that at the same time as the US is thinking, could we be more expansive in how we look at innovation and merger control? I think there's a question in Europe about whether this approach to innovation competition in Dow DuPont is sustainable and will be replicated in future cases. And in particular, one of the big criticisms of that case has been that the way the innovation harm was articulated, you would essentially have an innovation harm in every case that is a reduction of competitors from 4 to 3 in an industry where innovation is important. And there is no kind of way around that. And clearly, in other areas of competition analysis, it's not the case that any 4 to 3 is automatically a problem, full stop. And then there's also the Hutchinson judgment that came out last month, where the EC lost an appeal on a prohibition of the Hutchinson O2 case. And while that case isn't about innovation competition, the judges in that case did make a point that the EC's burden is particularly high where it pursues novel theories of harm, and kind of took the commission to task and said, look, you guys are bound by your guidelines and the EU merger regulation, and you have to follow those. And so on the EU side, actually, we may be seeing a bit of pushback on some of these novel theories of harm, and maybe they get reined in a bit. We hope.
Yeah. Maybe that would be interesting to follow this opposing trends. Somehow, U.S. taking more into account innovation and a pushback in Europe. Maybe this would be kind of food for thought alongside the crisis. Thanks, Antonia. Thanks, Jenn. Luis, now you have the floor. I guess we don't have any somehow this U.S. EU discussion is we are in a kind of interesting position. Brazil is in kind of interesting position to just bring some elements and some case law, of course, to help our analysis in Brazil. But of course, we have mostly merger review. We have a place of our own. Brazil has a huge track record in many industry. It's not in that sense and tiny jurisdiction, not at all. Many alongside many high-profile multi-jurisdictional cases, we have our own big companies merger cases to review. Many of them. What do you think would be a Brazilian perspective, so to say? But of course, your perspective on that discussion. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Okay. So morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, Bernardo. So at this point, I think there are a lot of things on the table already. So I'll try to comment on some specific points each one have said before, and I will start with your issues, Bernardo. You started asking about like stronger versus weaker antitrust standards, and well, I agree much. I talk about myself with my personal opinion. I'm not talking about the CADE's view.
Duly noted. So
from my perspective, okay. So from my perspective, I agree very much with what Paulo said. I think there's no rush to change standards. Standards are not fixed. They change every 5 years, 10 years, from time to time. So we will keep an eye on standards. They change from market to market. So it's really case by case. I mean, I would love to have concentration. No market share below 20%. In some markets, that just simply impossible. You don't have 4 companies. You don't have 5 companies, which would require that. And so it's part of life that you do adjust your analysis based on the second. That has been done from the last, I don't know, many years, decades. So I don't see this crisis as bringing like any rush for change. We, again, agreeing with what Paulo said, is not to say that won't change the case by case analysis, because the cases will change, will probably change. So and since I said the standards vary from industry to industry, then of course, if you have more cases in a more concentrated standard, you have perception that standards have changed, but I don't see that happening. I mean, I see standards are the same. I mean, economic theory is the same. We basically try to balance efficiencies and consumer welfare. The main goal is like providing a good environment for innovation, free competition, free markets, and at the very end, low prices and good quality. So those are the concerns. And what theory says is that, I mean, this is based on a bunch of different forces, which include like demand elasticity, which is sector specific, which includes like market shares, existence of stronger or weaker substitute product. I don't. None of that will change. I mean, those are the elements we have for the analysis. The way you mix those elements might possibly change because you are analyzing different sectors. So, for instance, the whole internet sector is very new. It's the discussion about platforms. This is new economic theory. This is not something that something that has been done for the last 10 or 15 years, and it couldn't be very much different because this is a very recent phenomenon. But so the way we analyze mergers in the internet sector will probably change over time. Not that Brazil will change it by itself, but I think the world and everybody will think about will have new ideas, new contributions from many different areas will come, and we will change. But not because of this crisis, just because this is a new sector and because there's a lot of new issues that haven't been solved before. So that is pretty much what I have on the standards of mergers and acquisitions. Let me comment a few things on what others have said. So Paulo has mentioned like bring us the difference between antitrust standards, government policies, and changes in law. And we have been seeing some changes in law here in Brazil during this crisis. CADE has been very active in advocacy for policy competition, and I think it has been very successful. And of course, if the law changes, then everybody has to change. We've got to follow the law, and no discussion about that. But I would be careful with changes in law.
Even being economists,
well, you might complain, but I mean, you end up following the law. you might not agree with what has been proposed, but I mean,
sure, just kidding.
It is the law, and we did have some potentially bad changes, which end up not being that bad at all in the end, because the crisis was perhaps less deep than we expected in the beginning, at least so far in Brazil. And as I said, the institutions have been making advocacy and pushing Congress to alleviate some ideas that seems to be nice from during the crisis, such as like protecting some sectors, prohibiting, so that there was like a proposal of like putting ceiling on prices of alcohol and other masks and things like that. And this is a well-known bad policy. I mean, we shouldn't do that. Although it looks like reasonable when you see prices going up because there is like an unexpected boom in the demand. Well, that is exactly the force that will bring more producers to produce masks. And at the first weeks, we didn't have masks for everybody.
From China,
nowadays,
for sure.
I mean, nowadays you find masks on the street. Everybody has a mask to sell. I mean, it has been produced inside homes, inside firms. I don't know where. The point is that prices are important to bring that force to act. So yeah, initially price of masks went high in the sky, and then offer of masks are everywhere, and prices are back to normal. So I don't. So this is just an example that a policy that has been proposed and wasn't approved, which I mean, I connect to what Paulo said about government policies and changes in law. So I think it was also. I think I don't remember if it was Bernardo or who else brought the case of Boeing and Embraer in Europe. So, and I remember Jean mentioning about
Put
like,
the blame on me. Yeah.
okay, and Jane has mentioned cases in which like international relation or international interests have been placed in cases where involve companies from different countries. Well, in my view, this is like a bad example of how industrial or international policies interact with antitrust. I think antitrust really is not about, it's not about industrial policy. It's not about international policy. It is about keeping a good environment, competitive environment, and good environment for innovation and low prices. It has those goals are completely independent on other government policies. And whenever other government policies interfere on those goals, I believe they're so important that advocacy becomes essential to in some way balance this conflict. I like the sentence from Paulo saying that competition authorities should act according to the existing standards, just like a referee. I particularly like this term. Yeah, we're basically balancing efficiency and consumer welfare, and we shouldn't take sides. Paulo also bring the idea of money, state money on airline companies. This is a very provocative issue for me. Yeah, I would be very much against, it has nothing to do with competition policy, but I would be very much against putting state money on, in Brazil, for instance, on airline companies. If I had a voice on that, I don't. But one might argue that this crisis might be made heavier because of government policies, and in that case, perhaps you have an argument. I don't agree with that. Okay, I think crisis is the crisis. I mean, I think government end up alleviating a little bit the crisis, but I mean, it is a big problem, and airline companies will suffer particularly in the short run because basically nobody's flying, and even in the long run because I believe we will change some habits we have, and we might fly a little bit less. I don't know, but I mean it's possible. But if someone decide to put money on a state company in Brazil, the standard way to do that would be through the development bank, BNDES. And so just for Antonia and Jenn, those are this is a state-owned bank which basically has some private equity money to invest on companies, usually motivated by industrial policies. And if so, BNDES usually has a plan to exit, an exit plan. So it's usually something you buy from a time, you build up the sector, you profit from that, and leave. So I think we are covered on that topic if this idea comes up, but I don't think it will. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it might. We never know how deep we're going to be the crisis. It might. We might have something like that. It's clearly not up to me. Finally, I think I took 2 points from what Antonia said. So it wasn't clear to me, Antonia, you can correct me, but you mentioned like the idea of taking away from consumer-based standard. I'm not sure if you agree with that, or if you mentioned that some left-wing politicians are saying that in the US. And the question whether we should, an antitrust policy should worry about inequality, social policy, and industrial policy. So the thing, it's perhaps a good idea to take one step back and remember, why do we care so much about consumers and why economists keep insisting on the welfare analysis? Well, essentially, consumers are people. So if you care about consumers, saying that we should care about consumers is saying we should care about people. We should care about the people that lives in the streets too, and everyone else. And good competition environment it can't hurt anyone. It may not alleviate extreme poverty, but I don't see a way to do that through competition policy. I think extreme poverty should be alleviated with proper social policies targeting that issue, and I don't see a role for antitrust on that. And taking away from the consumer-based standard would probably lead us to a very bad situation in which instead of being concerned about everyone, all consumers, agencies start to be concerned about particular groups that pretend to be the weaker, but in fact they're not the weakest part of the society, especially in Brazil for sure. So like when you say, oh, we shouldn't protect, we should avoid a failing firm. I would say perhaps something. I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I think failing is part of capitalism. It's important to have failures. We should protect some particular industries because those employ a lot of people. Yeah, those employ one particular, like a few thousand people, but those are very particular in countries like Brazil and the US, where you have like hundreds of millions of people living in. So I would like a strong defense on consumer-based standard. I think this is a great advance that economists have bring to policies in general, government policies in general, and I would defend it. So those are pretty much my comments on what we have discussed so far. I'll be glad to listen and commenting back.
Thanks much, Luis. I guess you have touched a point that also the audience is willing to have some more comments. Sylvia, my colleague Sylvia, is encouraging the audience to bring us some questions, and she's just touched exactly failing firm defense in the crisis. I guess this is interesting. I would say the standard answer would be, let's stick to the rules, let's stick to the standards, let's just apply the same rules, same standards to various situations. So if the situation is different,
so
we will have a different result. Yeah.
If you allow me, I would say let's change in the same with the same speed we have been changing so far. I'm not proposing we stay as we are. I mean, we'll keep changing.
Sure.
But because new discoveries will come.
Sure. I guess it would be interesting to have a flavor about this failing firm stuff as related to one, efficiencies. Most jurisdictions, I would say all jurisdictions, are very skeptical about taking into account efficiencies. They would, of course, say that there is a balance between harm to competition and efficiencies, but I guess, and Christine Wilson has just mentioned just a few weeks ago in a very interesting, provocative paper that maybe antitrust enforcers are kind of biased. They are very willing to accept harm to competition as related to number of competitors and price effects, but they are not that willing to accept efficiencies on the same basis. So they will put the burden of proof, very strict burden of proof, to the firms on efficiencies claims. So how this would be a barrier, so to say, to apply more effectively, if need be, failing firm defense. Who else would like to comment on this? Would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think in both. Oh, go ahead, Paolo. Okay. So in both the U.S. and Europe right now, the problem with the failing firm defense is that the bar is almost insurmountably high, and that's for two reasons. One, because the threshold and the tests that you have to meet is incredibly difficult to meet, but also because it takes forever for any of the regulators to assess the failing firm defense and decide whether or not it applies. So by the time you go through an EU phase 2 or a US second request in a company that's on the precipice of bankruptcy, it's way too long. So, I think there's really two questions here about the failing firm defense. Should the bar be lowered in any way? I mean, I think the situations where an actual, takeover should be allowed, that would be anti-competitive because the company's failing really are and should be very limited. But at a minimum, procedurally, it would be useful if there was some faster way to progress failing firm cases to take account of the fact that if you can't do it quickly, there's really no point.
In the EU, isn't there you can apply for a derogation, right?
You can, but it's like the failing firm defense itself. It's so rarely granted, so as to be not really all that useful.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., you mentioned bankruptcy. I mean, the U.S. has a robust bankruptcy system, and that is designed to protect failing firms and give them some shelter while they can reorganize themselves and get their acts together. And a lot of companies do successfully emerge from Chapter 11 reorganization proceedings, and sometimes you do have sales in bankruptcy, and that actually is usually conducted per an auction. So I suppose in theory, if you have a company that's in Chapter 11 and its biggest competitor turns out to be the winner in the auction, or maybe the only one who showed up to the auction, I mean, right there, that maybe is prima facie evidence that the company is in financial distress because it did go into bankruptcy, and two, actually, in fact, the biggest competitor is actually the only entity interested in acquiring it. Although I suppose you'd also have to show that absent the transaction, the reorganized company wouldn't be able to reorganize itself and come out of Chapter 11, and so the only option would be this sale. But it does sound like a lot of that does take time, obviously, and bankruptcy proceedings, I think, are reasonably quick, but they can drag on. And the company, obviously the bankrupt company, would be suffering some harm in the interim, losing customers, suppliers, etc.
Any comments, Paulo? Yeah.
Hi. Yes, Bernardo. I was just about to say, just to echo Antonia and Jenn, I think that from the OECD standpoint, this is more or less the conclusion that we found, in the sense of applying the stick to the rules that the rules says, as Jenn has pointed out, and Antonia as well. There is quite a high bar to meet in order to fulfill the requirements in order to apply the failing firm defense. But if I may just add something different, Bernardo, for what has been said, I think it's important to maybe take one step back and highlight that this specific topic of failing firm defense concerns specifically what it stands: failing firm defense. So there's nothing against acquisition of firms that are failing. So as Commissioner Braido has stated, failure is part of capitalism, and I think it's a fair point. I think it's a very simple way of stating. There's nothing against of firms being bought, failing firms that are going to fail, being bought by others. The issue that is under stress here, or that concerns competition authorities and competition policy, is failing firm defense. Why am I highlighting this? If you take, for instance, CADE's, the Brazilian Competition Authority's backlog, there's around 400 transactions that are notified every year. Commissioner Braido, and maybe even Bernardo can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that, just to give a big number, only 10% of these cases have a competition issue. 90% of them are cleared without any restrictions. So we're talking about 40 cases in 400. The failing firm defense will only apply after
this is a lot.
after a competition assessment is made, and if there's no remedies, then companies will put forward what is called a failing firm defense in order to approve, to authorize a merger that has a competition concern. So, of course, the criteria the criteria are difficult to meet, but also there's not that much cases. I mean, because there's 400 transactions that is notified, only 40 of them have competition concerns. Most of them will find remedies, either structural remedies, behavior remedies, depending on the case. But we call it failing firm defense because it's usually applied in the end of a merger review process in order to try to authorize or try to find a solution in 1, cases that have a competition concern, 2, that were unable to tackle these concerns through, I would call it traditional means or standard means, a remedy, a behavior remedy, or a structural remedy, and only then a failing firm defense will apply. So there's a lot of counterfactual involved, and at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons that make it difficult to have cases as well. I mean, there's not that much of transactions that will lead to this moment of the analysis, and therefore we'll have this test applied usually in the very end of the merger review process. I hope to have succeeded to make myself clear, but I just wanted to highlight maybe this important aspect, just taking one step back in order to contextualize the discussion of failing firm defense.
Thanks, Paulo. I guess we are coming to the end of this panel, but just final comments from each one, if you want to. I say that I have the kind of a flavor that we end up with some, and it is not unusual in merger review, mainly for us economists. We are always thinking about more complex cases. So we are talking about this 10% or even less that kind of mirrors some global cases. And I guess the lesson here, I guess, maybe if you have another meeting like in 6 months from now, when the crisis would be presenting concrete cases, more concrete beyond airlines, maybe we will be talking about concrete cases. So to say, I guess the message would be maybe we will have the same rules, a kind of a case-by-case approach. And so in time, we will have maybe the opportunity to build up some, not necessarily another stand. Let's wait for the politicians, so to say, and the outer world to bring us some recommendations. But as for our role, we'll just be working on a day-by-day basis and case by case. Any comments and final comments about this? Something, Antonia, Luis, you'd like to add? Jenn, we have not a very strict timing here because this is an open channel. So
if I could add a few things about this failing firm discussion. So just like Antonia said, I mean, Brazil has I'll talk about a Brazilian perspective. So Brazil has a bankruptcy law that's pretty much inspired in the US bankruptcy law. So we essentially have this rules very similar to Chapter 11. And again, I think I totally agree with what you said about, I mean, those that being a good standard to decide whether the firm has attempted to do everything that was possible before going to bankruptcy. And usually, who basically runs the selling of a firm that is being under stress are the banks and other financial institutions that are basically the own the debt of that firm. So they will probably be those interested in selling. And the good thing about that is, well, they are also the institutions that have access to capital and to bring capital from other countries and things like that. So I do have a hope, and it's really a hope, and I do expect we don't have many failing firm cases, essentially because those banks who basically will be owning because of taking the collateral of the debts and trying to sell the firm have access to international companies and might be able to bring new players to Brazil, and that is, I do hope we do not have a great impact on that, but that's hope. And one thing that is particularly good about Brazil is that our interest rate was really affected. So Brazil is particularly cheap to buy things nowadays. So it's perhaps wishful think, but I do have this comfort. I mean,
even cheaper in dollar.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
what I mean. I mean, the exchange rate is the dollars. The Brazilian real was so much undervalued that, I mean, it's a good time to buy. And interest rates all over the world are so low that, I mean, as we start to see the end of this crisis, I do expect a lot of money shopping things all over the world. And again, like Paulo said, I mean, selling a failing firm is not a problem, not a competition problem, unless you sell to your competitor. I mean, so I do have good expectations about the future. I'm not pessimistic. So this is pretty much what I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks much, Luis.
I think from my perspective, this is my U.S. perspective. I think we'll see what happens with the election. We'll see what happens in the House and the Senate, and if Biden's elected. But I would point out, though, that even if the Democrats take the House and Senate and Biden's elected, then I think I don't think it's going out very far on a limb to say that we'll certainly see some merger control related legislation. I don't know what form that would take. There's many options. But even if the Democrats don't take the House and Senate, but Biden is elected, there is a fair amount actually that the agencies can do through the rulemaking process without having to get congressional approval. So one example of that was the revision to the HSR rules a few years ago that brought in exclusive patents in the pharma industry into the ambit of the HSR rules, such that they now need to be notified. That was done through a rulemaking process. So even if you don't see formal legislation, there is going to be a lot, if Biden's elected, that the FTC and DOJ can do on their own. So I think you would see some changes in enforcement. I think you would see some changes in how the agencies evaluate transactions. It'll be an interesting time, that's for sure, for all of us.
Yeah.
And maybe if I can just add to what Antonia said,
Please.
I mean, I think on the European side, we're not going to see a massive overhaul of the merger control system. It's going to be business as usual with tweaks on the margins. But the other thing that we haven't mentioned that is and will continue to be really relevant in EU is foreign investment review. where in response to the COVID crisis, we have seen regimes all over Europe, all over the world, either putting foreign investment regimes in place for the first time, or expanding the regimes that they have, or just using them more aggressively than they have before. And I think, even as this crisis goes away, that's something that's here to stay. And it's, sort of a parallel track where regulators can look at, some of these more public interest concerns. The scope of those reviews is very different country by country, but this is somewhere where I think we will see a lot of change and a lot of new regimes and legislation, even if the competition merger control process stays, moving along at its usual slow and steady pace.
Yeah, it would be a great time to live despite the crisis, I would say, despite the victims. I mean, business victims we're talking about, of course. So anguish, but I guess we'll have some lively facts and to talk about. Maybe we can plan maybe to another meeting in person, and not just in this virtual environment, to try to reassess what we have said. This is being recorded, so we can just refresh it in a few months, and so see if everyone would stick to their comments and how to refresh it. So thanks very, very, very much for your availability, Jenn, Antonia, Paulo, Luis. Thank you so much. Thanks our enormous audience, or just a tiny audience, as you wish. So thank you so much. Have a very nice day. Please stay safe and healthy, everybody. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you so much for organizing this.
Bye.